Our top story tonight, Italy's Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte has announced his resignation in a blistering speech delivered before the country's Senate. Mr. Conte blasted Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini, the man who triggered Italy's current political crisis by breaking up the ruling coalition. Conte criticised Salvini's push for a no-confidence motion and new elections, accusing the League party leader of putting personal and party interest before those of the country. Well, let's cross over to the Italian capital and speak to our correspondent there, Giorgia Orlandi now. Giorgia, this debate is continuing. Where do things stand right now?
Good evening, Talks. Well, as we understand, the debate is still ongoing. We're waiting for Prime Minister Conte to make his conclusions. Then he will be on his way to the Quirinale Palace, where I'm currently standing here outside. He's expected to arrive around 8:30. A few cameras lined up over here. Here is where he will meet with President Mattarella. He will put his mandate back in his hands. And this is the act that formally marks the start of the government crisis. President Mattarella will begin political consultations. He will meet with political groups, trying to see whether a new majority is possible, perhaps led by Prime Minister Conte once again. This should be last around a couple of days, and then at the end of that we'll know whether there is a new coalition, there is a new government in place, perhaps a new coalition between the Empire State Movement and the Democratic Party. But going back to that debate, quite a long debate, Prime Minister Conte spoke for about an hour. As we knew, this was his chance to take the floor, a chance also to say things that perhaps he did not dare to say before. As we understand, he tried to overturn Salvini's latest statement when he said that this government is the government that always says no, and instead Conte tried to prove a different story. But also this was a chance for Prime Minister Conte to take revenge on Salvini. He made a full list, point by point, of the things that he does not like about the Interior Minister. First of all, the fact that he did not brief the Parliament on the ongoing investigation on alleged funds received by the League from Russia. But also he said, well, it's clear that he took advantage of the situation to cash on his party's increasing popularity. And then we heard from Salvini himself. He tried to justify his decision, and he said, well, I'm open to the possibility of a new compromise with the Empire State Movement. Let's vote on a couple of reforms, the one that will cut the number of lawmakers and Italy's budget bill, and then let's go back to the polls.
Well, Giorgia, if things weren't confusing enough, tell us more about what Salvini had to say there. You say he said that he's willing to make a deal over next year's budget. Why would he say that now?
Well, this is Salvini's offer to the Empire State Movement, to President Mattarella, but he has not changed his mind. He wants to go back to the polls as soon as possible. As we know, if we look at what has been happening behind the scenes in terms of negotiations amongst different parties, we know that the Empire State Movement and the Democratic Party are now the two actors. They are trying to form a new coalition. We know that this option is very much favored by two key figures inside both parties. One is comedian Beppe Grillo, the other one is Romano Prodi, provided, as Luigi Di Maio requested, that Renzi is not part of that coalition. But as things stand now, it looks like Salvini is a little bit out of the game, and as one of Salvini's closest aide said, well, the risk is that the League might end up in opposition for a long time.
Giorgia Orlandi there with the latest from the Italian capital. Thank you. Well, Alberto Alemano joins us now from Turin for a closer look at these developments. He's a professor of European law at HEC Paris. Well, thanks for taking time to speak to us here today. A chaotic day in the Italian capital, with Giuseppe Conte standing down or offering to stand down. Does this mean that the chance of new snap elections is becoming a real prospect?
Well, we are not there yet. In reality, we are just at the beginning of a long journey that might lead to snap elections. But this is just one possible scenario, possibly the least likely at the moment. What we know now is that the Italian experience with the first self-proclaimed populist government is over. That's something we have learned only today officially. This political crisis has been formalized, and Mr. Conte decided to step down without even having a vote within the Senate, which is obviously a sign that there's no possibility for this government to continue, and in particular for the League and the Five Star Movement to continue. However, the Italian constitution requires the outgoing prime minister to actually not only resign, but actually allow the president to investigate, explore whether an alternative majority can be found within the parliament. This is something that might be unveiled in the next few hours, and it seems quite likely that even the most opposing, let's say, political parties seem to be keen on finding an alternative solution, and therefore a new political majority, which apparently might be an alliance between the Five Star Movement and the very same Partito Democratico, which has been at the opposition over the last year and a half.
Well, you talk there of that possible alliance. How difficult would it then be for these parties, which have been quite diametrically opposed, to put aside their differences and come together for the better of the country?
Well, that's a fantastic question, because as you might know, the differences existing between the Five Star Movement and the League were actually even more important when these two parties decided in the aftermath of the March election in 2018 to form a government, a self-proclaimed government of change. Today, obviously, a lot of things have happened, and the relationship between the Five Star Movement and the Partito Democratico are much worse than they actually look like in the aftermath of those elections. But there seemed to be some consensus, even within the Partito Democratico, under the Renzi's, let's say, shadow leadership, to actually give it a chance and try to put together a government that might stabilize the political climate, might actually transition the Italian political situation and economic one towards new elections in 1 or 2 years' time. This scenario seems to be quite unlikely only a few weeks ago, and this is also surprising for Mr. Salvini, and that's how we can read his own hesitation today in chastising his own political ally, the Five Star Movement, and accepting at the end of the day to possibly consider to embark on a constitutional reform that the Five Star Movement really wanted since the beginning, but he actually opposed over the last year and a half.
Alberto Alemano, Professor of European Law at HEC in Paris, thanks for talking to us here on Euronews Tonight.